The honourable member for Nanaimo, Cowichan, the Island.
Mr. Speaker, I merely wanted to ask the Minister just to clarify the statement he's made. My understanding, I may be incorrect, but my understanding is that Mr. Jacques Parizeau, Minister of Finance in the province of Quebec, had asked for $40 million as part of the settlement, and that the balance, the $186 million, could be paid on either basis, either on the basis of $85 on rebate on this year's tax, or $100 on the basis of 1978. Now the minister says that there's some administrative difficulty. I would have thought that the opposite would be true, that it would be much better if all of the provinces were on the same basis, and that is that this amount of reduction would be on the 1978 tax year and would be for $100. The government has always been very strong in saying it doesn't want any special status for any province. It wants all treated alike. It seemed to me that if it's correct that Mr. Parizeau said that he doesn't care which of the options the federal government selects, I can't understand why the minister hasn't selected the one that would have had a uniform application to all the provinces and removed a good deal of the irritation that has been generated during this debate.
The Honourable Minister
I'd like
of Finance.
to clarify this point. In fact, in the letter of Mr. Parizeau, what it's called is option 2, is that he is asking for $40 million right away and $85 on the taxpayers list of 78, but to be deducted from the income tax of the Quebec taxpayers only in the spring at the time of filing. And that's why there is in his request something that is different from the other provinces. The week before what I have done, I had offered to deduct the $100 in 1970, in fact the spring 79, but he have rejected that proposition, wanted to have $40 million cash and $85 million in the spring. So I think that as we wanted to make the federal contributions for the money left over because there was no agreement on the $186 million, not to penalize the Quebecers because there was no agreement between the level of governments, that we've decided to proceed with an $85 payments right away. There's a lot of people who don't know why we have to do that way. And it's because, as the honourable member knows, because I think at that time he was Premier of Saskatchewan. It's when Mr. Duplessis decided to have his own tax collection system that we have to operate in a different fashion. It's not due to an action of the federal government. In Saskatchewan or in Ontario or in Manitoba, you know, the night of the budget, I've reduced my income tax by $100, and those ministers of finance in the week after rose their income tax by $100, and with the proceed they agreed to my plans to reduce sales tax. But in the case of Quebec, there was no such agreement. There is no collection agreement with Quebec since 1954, and it's why we have to rebate the money to the taxpayers in Quebec directly. And of course, if the provincial government want to recuperate any part of it, of all of it, or even more than it, it is within their own power to do so. And they can do that, you know, it's always their privilege and their options to do whatever they want, interfere with their own tax, just like I'm doing what I want with my tax. But if Mr. Parizeau had agreed, as I offered to him 2 weeks ago, tomorrow, to have Quebec included in clause Schedule 1, I would have been willing to do so. And it would have been exactly symmetrical with the other provinces in being in Schedule following clause 30A. But he does not want it. He wants a $40 million cash because he has qualified partially to the federal national programs, and for the rest, you know, I'm just following the intention that the government had at the time of tabling the budget.
Order, please. Before recognizing the honourable member for the Nanaimo, Cowichan, the Island, on a point of order raised previously by the honourable member for York Simcoe, I think if we refer to the votes and proceedings of Monday, June the 12th, page 858 in the fourth paragraph, the order being read for the consideration of a Ways and Means motion to amend the Income Tax Act, sessional paper number 303-1 and 308-308D, laid upon the table Thursday, June the 8th, 1978, Mr. Chrétien, seconded by Mr. Cullen, moved that the motion be concurred in, and the question was put on the motion and it was agreed to. I think that clarifies that point. The honourable member from Nanaimo, Couch and the Island.
Mr. Speaker, this is not the first time that the minister has tried to explain the situation by virtue of the fact that Quebec is the only province which doesn't have a tax collection agreement with the federal government. I know that they haven't got that, and matter of fact, I was at the conference when Mr. Duplessis announced that they would not continue the tax collection agreement with the federal government. However, I don't follow the logic of the minister as to why that needs to make any difference. If the federal government made it clear now that on the 1978 tax year, they were prepared when people submit their income tax returns next spring, that they were going to be allowed a $100 deduction, same as then the provincial government, the government of Quebec, could adjust its taxes as it saw fit. It could either collect that $100 or it could let the Quebec taxpayer have it. I see no reason why there should be two different schemes on two different bases. And I think a good deal of the difficulty the minister's had with this bill has been quite unnecessary. The minister several times has been very critical of the government of Quebec because he doesn't agree with their separatist policies, and neither do I. But I must say that, first of all, I resent this attempt to smear anybody who asks for equal and fair treatment for Quebec as being a separatist or in being in bed with separatists. I think that's a sort of cheap type of politics that doesn't get a minister or the government anywhere. It smacks of the McCarthy era, when if you couldn't call you a communist, they said you were soft on communism, or you were in bed with the communists, or you were advocating the kind of thing that a communist would advocate if he were in your place. You know, that really doesn't do anything for anybody. I think we have to look at this thing fairly, and the fact of the matter is that the minister has to accept a good deal. I didn't get into the fight when he was being attacked, because I think the minister's got a difficult job and he took it on and is doing the best he can. But I say to the minister that I think he got himself into a good deal of the trouble by the ham-handed way in which this whole question of the reduction in the retail sales tax has been handled. First of all, there was a finance minister's conference. Then there was a first minister's conference. Those were the places when it should have been suggested to the provinces that the federal government thought that the most speedy way in which to give an economic stimulus to the economy was to cut the retail sales tax, and that the federal government was prepared to make some compensation in return for such action. But that wasn't done. And the finance ministers went home and the premiers went home and proceeded to prepare their budget. And I ask the members of this committee to put yourself in the position of a provincial premier who's worked out his budget. He's got a very small surplus. He just thinks he's going to break even or a little better, enough to cover any unforeseen contingencies. And then he gets a phone call or a visit from the federal minister of finance, who says, now, we're prepared to pay 2/3 of the cost of cutting your sales tax by 3 percentage points for 6 months, or 2 percentage points of a reduction for 9 months. Now, what does it mean to the provincial treasurer? It means that he's now going to be in a deficit position. He doesn't want to be in a deficit position, but he can't turn it down. What position is he going to be in when the budget night, the Minister of Finance says, I offered Province A or Province B to cut the sales tax 3 percentage points, and you said you didn't want it. And he turned down X million dollars, which he would have gotten compensation. It doesn't say, of course, that that provincial treasurer would have had to find the money to put up the provincial share of that reduction. And if given enough notice prior to making budgets, a provincial treasurer and a provincial premier could probably adjust to that. But they can't do it on the basis of a few days' notice. And that's the reason, really, why much of the difficulty has occurred. And I think the minister overlooks that. And I think in handling the situation vis-a-vis Quebec, that instead of making a cause célèbre out of the situation with reference to Quebec, the finance minister would have been much better to have been completely flexible in dealing with the situation, because I am convinced that he's done a great deal more to strengthen the hand of the government of Quebec than he has to weaken it. And I think also that having two different formulae and two different tax years as the base for paying this rebate is going to continue to rankle among the provinces. And I think it was totally unnecessary. I think it could have been a uniform arrangement. There isn't any reason at all why the minister couldn't have paid, in my opinion, couldn't have paid the $40 million to Quebec and put them on the $100 deduction for the tax year 1978. I think if the minister had done that, he would have saved himself a lot of headaches.
I think that I'm very pleased that the honorable member just said that I should have consulted even more. I just would like him to talk to his leader, who got up in this house the day before the budget, to ask me that to tell the House and the nation that I had missed my obligation as the Minister of Finance to budget secrecy. That because I had talked to the provinces that I have gone away with a great British tradition of not having anybody to know anything about the budget beforehand. And I'm very pleased that, you have more experience than him. You will teach him a few lessons on that. That I just did perhaps not enough consultation, but much too much for the member for Oshawa, because he felt that I had betrayed one of the great British tradition of keeping the secret so much that some years ago the Minister of Finance will inform his colleague in the cabinet only hours before his budget what had happened. And I would like to say to the honourable member that it was not done in a very rush manner, because the first time I raised that problem with the province was at the first meeting I had with the Minister of Finance in October. Already, people were feeling that the problems in the economy was too low demand, and we had to stimulate the demand. I raised that question in October with them. There was some interest, but not too much. I raised it again in the month of January. There was more interest, but there was no agreement. And by the time of the budget times, I took 3 weeks to try to negotiate an agreement with all of them. 8 of them who were involved, but Alberta having no sales tax were not involved, agreed to the procedure that I had said that I was to deal with this problem in an hypothetical situation, and they were to say yes. Only Quebec and Mr. Parizeau did not fulfill that obligation and came 48 hours later with a different scheme, and it was too late for the other provinces to do the same thing because already they had passed their own legislation. In terms of the problem for the treasurer, I do think that if in the period of 6 months there is an increase of something like 15% over normal sales, the provinces will recuperate enough money to pay back their 1/3 or something like that, or close by. And in fact, I've heard some reports from some treasuries of the different provinces who are very pleased with the increase in the retail sales tax revenue following the cut. And as they add on it to pay 1/3 of the cut, if there is 15 or 20% increase, as they still have some revenue out of it, they will compensate their losses by those added revenue. So I have done my best. The mechanism is not perfect. I'm the first to recognize it. What I've tried to do is to involve the provinces for the first time in the history in trying to develop an economic policy that made sense for everybody. Of course, perhaps some say that I went a bit too far in my argumentation, but I do think that a lot of people have blamed me, saying I was naive to not force everybody to sign an agreement before the night of the budget. But it was not, in my judgment, naivety. you know, for the great success in banking of the honorable member, you know, he will be well advised to shut up. And I just say that I talked to all the ministers, and I consider the separatist Minister of Finance in Quebec, not as a separatist, but as a Minister of Finance, who was there to do what was the best with the other provinces to stimulate the Canadian economy. Some say that I should have forecast that he wanted to throw a wrench in the gears of a good federal schemes, and I don't apologize because I treated him as a normal Minister of Finance. Because if I had gone up in this House the night of the budget to say that, sorry, but I did not try because I could not trust the Quebec government because they don't have the same goals and we're having a prosperous Canada, everyone would have laughed at me and say that, you know, Chrétien, you're wrong, you should just treat everybody else, every Minister of Finance equally. But fine, what I want to say, and I've tried to do something that never a Minister of Finance have tried to do, and when you are Premier you know that. Never the Ministers of Finance went to Saskatchewan to discuss the federal budget before they introduced it in the House. And at the time you were Premier of Saskatchewan, if I'm not mistaken, here in Ottawa, the cabinet ministers were informed the day of the budget of what was in the budget. So I think I've come a long way to try to break with this tradition that in my judgment make not much sense as long as we avoid speculation in the marketplace. That there should be more consultation, not only with the governments, but some of the fiscal problems should be referred to some committee of this House before the budget, so that we can have an input not only from the very good advisors we're having within the departments, but from the House of Commons on some specific problems. And I have made a reference already this year on the commodity tax problem to the committee of the House so that they can look into that and make recommendations. I don't know if I will accept them or not, but there was some study being conducted outside and I would like to have the input of both sides of the House before I make up my mind about it. But it's not easy, because if you lead the public to know too much of what you're thinking, you run the risk that there could be some speculation and you find yourself in a very difficult situation. So to ally the British tradition of secrecy of the budget and, if I can use the term, participatory democracy, it's quite complicated and you're taking some risk, and I've taken a lot of risk since I'm Minister of Finance, and I'm willing to take those risks. And to come back to the Quebec situation, if Mr. Parizeau had replied to me that my proposition of the Wednesday 2 weeks ago, to the effect that $100 deductible on the taxpayer list of 78, that will have confirmed the Quebec situation to the others, I would have been pleased. But one of the problems is, with the other provinces, the flow of money, as there is an agreement between governments, the flow of money is going into the coffer, into the economy of the province right away. But in the case of Quebec, as there is no agreement, there is $186 million that I keep in my treasury. And if I want that money to go into the Quebec economy, I have to take the list of the 1977 taxpayer list and send them the rebate right away. Otherwise, they have to wait that we have the list of 78, and that list will be available only in 79, and the money will be in the Quebec economy, in theory, only in the spring of next year. And as I was dealing with a budget to stimulate the economy right away, I think that I have to move right away. That's why I'm doing that. But, you know, there is another element that people forget about it, is as we're dealing directly with the taxpayers in Quebec, and not because we're not collecting the taxes for Quebec, the people forget that there is 200,000 Quebecers, or more or less, who will not receive a rebate if I take the list of 78 for that very reason, that as we have deducted for them $100 so far this year, in January and February, or later on in the year, for those who pay less, only $100 during the year, that will take 12 months to get back the money. If I had an $85 on top of it, all those people who are paying in 78 only $100 or $100 will not qualify at all. And it's only those who pay between $100 normally and $185 of taxes that will qualify. So we would have eliminated that way 200,000 citizens in Quebec who are entitled to that credit. If Mr. Parizeau decides to tax back, I don't know what he will do. He has not told me and has not told anybody else. Perhaps he will go on income tax. Perhaps he can go on different sales tax. Perhaps he can go on corporation tax. I don't know. So I have to treat the taxpayers of Quebec with the knowledge I have. And the knowledge I have is that if I want that money to be in the Quebec economy, and if I don't want to penalize 200,000 Quebec citizens, I have to take the list of the taxpayers 77, because it's the only list available to me at this time, and send them a tax rebate based on the tax they paid last year.
The honourable member for Nanaimo Couch in the Island.
Mr. Chairman, the minister's worried about the 200,000 taxpayers that won't be covered if he leaves it till 1978. The fact of the matter is, of course, he's saying nothing about the hundreds of thousands of people who buy goods who won't get anything because they don't file an income tax, don't earn enough to pay income tax. The minister has never explained, at least to my satisfaction, why, when he said to the provinces, we want you to reduce your retail sales tax as being the fastest way to get money into circulation and give the economy a shot in the arm. Why it wouldn't be comparatively simple to have said, we will make an estimate which can be adjusted at the end of the fiscal year. We will make an estimate as to what it's going to cost you to cut your tax, either 3% across the board for 6 months or 2% across the board for 9 months, or even for selective reductions, which I think would just been as effective. And we will pay you in cash 90% of what that would be, or of what our share would be, and make the adjustment at the end of the year. May owe you some money, you may owe us some money. We'll make an adjustment so that we will have paid you whatever the federal government's share of reducing the sales tax in a lump sum that would have gone into the Treasury, would have been available to everybody. What the minister is going to do now is to hand out money to taxpayers, many of whom don't need it, and the amount of money they're getting has no relation whatsoever to what they've paid in sales tax as compared to somebody else who's going to get nothing and who has paid a lot of sales tax because they've got a large family. Never understood why the minister made this so complicated. May I say one other thing to the minister? May I say just another thing to the minister? When he makes reference to the member for Oshawa Whitby, he's quite incorrect when he says that he took exception to the minister consulting with the premiers. As a matter of fact, it was the day before the budget. He objected to the fact that the press were already reporting. He didn't know that the premiers had been consulted, as a matter of fact. The minister told us later they'd been consulted. And he was objecting to the press being informed and to leaks going on from the government. We in this party have never held to any sacred tradition about governments not being consulted, provincial governments not being consulted, or other agencies of government not being consulted. There may be certain forms of taxes where a person could make a killing on the stock market by having advance information, but that happens very, very seldom. That happens very seldom. And I know something about preparing budgets. I prepared some 18 budgets, and not only consulted with my cabinet, but consulted with my caucus and consulted with my political party, and sometimes with the Municipal Association of Rural Municipalities and Urban Municipalities as to how it was going to affect them. It doesn't have to be this secrecy, and I agree with the minister on that, and I'm glad that he's breaking away from that old tradition. But he still hasn't convinced me that this cumbersome and inequitable and unjust way of compensating for the reduction in the sales tax has been followed. As a matter of fact, I get the impression from the minister that the government has simply been clutching at straws. They recognize what everybody who has an elementary knowledge of economics recognizes, namely that the way to get an economy moving where only 82% of its capacity is in operation is to get purchasing power into the pockets of the people in low incomes. We all recognize that today we're not suffering from inflation. If we're suffering from inflation, we'd be producing more goods. We haven't got too much money chasing too few goods. We're not operating at more than 82% of our capacity. Our problem in Canada is that the people who have money don't need any more goods, and they reinvest it. And the people who need goods haven't got the money to buy the goods. And therefore the minister is quite right in recognizing you have to stimulate the economy. But how did they stimulate? They tried to do it by cutting corporation taxes. Of course, which we told them when the minister's predecessor before his predecessor, Mr. Turner, was cutting the corporation taxes. That the corporations are not going to invest money, even though you give them tax cuts, when they're not using the capacity they have. And the minister has clutched at one straw after the other, and I'd like to ask him specifically, when he says that he talked to the finance ministers at the finance ministers conference, I think it was in January, and when it was discussed for a while at the first ministers conference in February, was any specific proposal put before them? I know there may have been casual reference to the fact that, you know, if you cut the retail sales tax, it would give the economy a shot in the arm. But was there a specific proposal put before them saying, look, we're prepared to pay the major part of the cost, to reduce the sales tax, so as to get money into circulation, particularly among the low-income people. And here's the proposition. If a proposition like that was put before them, I think they would have accepted it. I think to put it before them when they'd made up their budgets and when they'd finished 2 conferences at which no agreement had been reached was really making their situation worse. And I think the minister has made the situation difficult for the provinces and difficult for himself, totally unnecessarily. And I ask him there specifically, was a concrete proposal put before the finance ministers or before the first ministers when they met in January and February?
Honorable Minister.
The Minister of Finance.
I think that we put forward a precise proposition in October to the Ministers of Finance, and it was a reduction in sales tax of 2 points at that time, of which I was to take half of the cost and the provinces were to take half of the cost. This was rejected in October, around the 10th of October 1977. We kept talking about it among officials and ministers when we had to talk, and we made some progress. It was not discussed at the first ministers' conference because we felt that it was a matter to be dealt at the level of ministers of finance, not necessarily at the premiers. So I think that I did not take anybody by surprise. Of course, they were all well informed since 6 months at the time of the budget that it was my priority and that I was trying to get an agreement on it. Of course, the honourable member asked me why we did not just pay cash payments to the provinces and let them all the freedom they wanted to do with that money. First is that why we decided not to have cash payments is because, I tried to find a way in which there was to be some money put into circulations, but it will not be an expenditures of the government. If I signed checks in the tune of $800 million in that scheme, I would have been obliged to write in my expenditures an expenditure of $800 million in making the payment to the provinces, who in turn would have used that money to cut taxes. And in terms of presentation, I know that the NDP party would not have objected too much, but I know a lot of people would have considered that as a big spender policy, adding $800 million to our expenditures. So I wanted to find a way that was not adding to my expenditures, I was just making the money in circulation anyway, in reducing my take in the tax system of Canada in the tune of $800 million. And I make room to the provinces to catch up that money in raising their own income tax. Why we did not give them all the freedoms that the honourable members speak about? We gave them all the freedom. When I started, I said I'd like to cut sales tax. So we discussed how to do that. And I came with that proposition that we were to pay the totality of the money to the Maritimes because they could not afford to participate and they don't have any manufacturing base in those provinces and they could ill afford to go in a scheme like that. Everyone agreed to it. All the ministers agreed to it. That was making sense. Of course, we I said to Alberta, there is nothing for you. I called the Minister of Finance in Alberta. I said, I'd like to help you to cut your sales tax. So he laughed and he said, I have no sales tax. But I said, fine, you're not involved, but of course, don't be too nervous about it. There will be other things in the budget that perhaps will please some sector of your economy, and it's why in the budget there was some special disposition for the EVR schemes that are of great interest to Alberta. So, with the other provinces in terms of how to cut the sales tax, there was all sort of suggestion being made to me by ministers. So we decided to call a meeting in Ottawa of all the officials of all the different governments to come to Ottawa for a full day, or we even forecast 2 days if necessary, to work out the details. They sat down. Some say we don't want to cut the sales tax on alcohol, on cigarettes, and on recreation. That was Ontario, because they had just rose that tax. So they discussed among every one of them. They said, no, that will not stimulate the economy to put money into that. So they all agreed among themselves that they were not to go in these three types of taxes. BC had a different problem, and Saskatchewan had a different problem, because being on both sides of Alberta, they said if we cut sales tax for 6 months, 3 points, we'll have a lot of political pressure not to reintroduce it later on. But they said that 2 points, that will make more sense, less difficult. So I made the proposition, okay, you go 2 points 9 months, or rather than 3.6 months. And we discussed that with the other provinces, and I made the same offer to the other provinces, and nobody else was interested. So now you're asking me why we did not discuss, and that was the question asked by the member for Brome-Missisquoi about selective sales tax. This was not raised by Quebec at all. Not at all. Neither by the minister, neither by the officials at the time of the negotiations. So we could not forecast that they wanted that. They didn't express their views about it. They didn't show their interest in that at all. So I could not offer that or discuss that or call a meeting on it. And then when the day of the budget came, Mr. Parizeau said, I have no answer for you, contrary to the agreement we had. So he came 48 hours later with his special way of cutting taxes. I don't want to pass a judgment if it's good or bad. It is within his jurisdiction. He's done what he wanted to do. Fine with me. Just like McHugh had done the same thing in Ontario 2 years before, with his own money. But when I received that offer, or that proposition not proposition, because it was not even a proposition, I was informed at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Wednesday, following the budget, that the sales tax in Quebec were to be cut selectively at 6 o'clock that night. It was not a great consultation. I was informed 3 hours before that it was to be done unilaterally. So I said, can I accept it or not? That was his question. Will you pay for that or not? I said, it's not part of the deal that had been agreed by the others, so I don't know what I will do. And before I gave him my answer, I called some ministers of finance. And I said, look what Quebec is doing on its own, and they would like to qualify for a national scheme with that. After talking to 3 ministers of finance, they all said it's too late. We have done it in our own jurisdiction. We have passed our legislation or make our announcement. Our sales tax is being cut since Monday night, and it's too late for us to make the same choice. So here I was. I had given my word on a procedure to all the ministers of finance. I tried to get their agreement to agree to the scheme by Mr. Parizeau, and they said to me, no way. As I had given my word to them before the budget that what the proposition on the table was, the proposition agreed among all the ministers at that time as the most sensible to cut sales tax, after the fact, when there was no agreement with Quebec, for the plans by Quebec by the other ministers of finance, I could not agree. I could not agree. I had given my word to the ministers of finance of the land, and I have evolved a scheme with them during 3 weeks. So Mr. Parizeau decided to go unilaterally. But in his scheme, he qualified for $40 million only. So we decided to pay him according to the schemes. And as there is no tax collection agreement, and in this act you will see that there is provision for adjustment, like you mentioned, at the end of the year. We forecast that in the reduction of income tax in Ontario, for example, $100 is too much for their cut of sales tax. So they will have to pay us back some $56 million. But in the case of BC, it's not enough. So we'll have to add to them $19 million and make the adjustment at the end of the year after verification in their books. But we could not come to an agreement with Quebec at all, and not only with them, but an agreement with Quebec that would have been acceptable to the other ministers of finance. So it's why we had this very unpleasant confrontation. And I'm sorry, I didn't provoke it. My meaning was, well, I wanted to do something that even the critics of the Tories, in a memo to his member of his caucus in January, said we have to keep pressing for the federal government, and it was read in this House by the Minister of Public Works, for a scheme to cut sales tax at the retail level. That was other proposition. I can quote it back later on. It was related to the provincial sales tax, and it was mentioned to the federal sales tax, but both. And you concluded in those times, but I know you're changing your mind according to the political mood, that you concluded at that time, Mr. Chairman, that the member for York Simcoe, that the most efficient way was sales tax at the retail level. So whatever, there was a consensus on that in this land. I've tried to do that. Perhaps I'm imputing motive in the heads of Mr. Parizeau and Mr. Levesque.
Order, please. The honourable member for York Simcoe, on a point of order.
Mr. Chairman, the minister has referred to a memorandum purportedly written by myself in which I said that the provincial sales tax was the proper approach. I'd like him to produce that memorandum.
I cited what the Minister of Public Works said in his House, and he read from a text, and he attributed that to the member. If you want to deny that you never wrote such a thing, fine. I will accept your word, and after that I will produce the document. But if you say you've not said that, say so. No, I said I will try to. I don't have the document, Mr. Chairman. I just said that if the honourable member deny that he ever wrote such a piece, fine, he can deny it. I just say that I have good reason to believe that when the Minister of Public Works spoke, he spoke with some knowledge, and we'll find where he got his documentation. But I don't have it with me. And I just say that, in the case of Quebec, they did not want to come to a national scheme. I said, and I repeat, that I'm not surprised. In their view of Canada, any good things being proposed by the federal government is not in their interest. Their political interest. They cannot, we know what are their political interests. Their political interest is to prove that Confederation has never worked, is not working, and will never work. So, they had a political interest to try to throw a wrench in my gears in that scheme. But I knew that they were to try that, but I acted in good faith, treating them just like any other government, as I should do, as long as they are part of Confederation. But when we have an agreement with 8 provinces, and the deal is concluded, to come 48 hours later on and said, I want something else, I had no choice. So they comply for $40 million, I will pay $40 million, and for $186 million, I'm paying it $85 right away. And if Mr. Parizeau wants to raise his taxes within his own jurisdiction, whatever he wants, it's up to him, not up to me. If he feels that he will carry on incurring a bigger deficit, that's his option. I don't know, I'm not running his shop. If he decides to go on income taxes, he will have to collect back the taxes that he has cut. He will have just a few months ago. We're reducing the taxes of the federal taxpayers in Quebec, and right away, so that the money will be in their pockets as quickly as possible, as seen in this bill.
The honourable member for Nanaimo, Carchin and the Island.
Mr. Chairman, I see the member for York Simcoe wants to speak, and I'm certainly not going to monopolize this discussion. I just want to say two things with respect to what the minister just said. First of all, I find it absolutely appalling that a minister of finance would say that the reason he has adopted a clumsy technique of making rebates which are inequitable and unjust, rather than paying cash to the provincial governments for tax collections which they have foregone, is because by so doing he would have enlarged his budget by some $800 million and he would have been criticized for it. Now surely that's incomprehensible. That a minister would adopt such a clumsy, unworkable, administratively difficult process. And the minister shakes his head. But, well, we'll see before he's finished. I've watched rebates. I watched the government of Alberta, the social credit government was in, making payments to people. Every citizen was to get a certain share of the oil revenue, and they made payments, and some people got paid twice, and a lot of people didn't get paid at all, and some people who were dead got paid. The minister hasn't finished with that one yet. But I'd say it's administratively clumsy. I think it's unfair and inequitable. And the only reason the minister can give is that if he had adopted a simple procedure, he would have added several $100 million to his budget and he would have been criticized. I think the people of Canada are not so naive that they're going to criticize him if they recognize that that money was being used to enable their provincial governments for a short period of time to reduce their sales tax. He hasn't got very much faith in the public if he advances that as an argument. It's a very weak argument indeed. The other point I want to make is that when the minister outlines, as he's done several times, his quarrel with the government of Quebec with respect to the selective tax cuts, he gives as his reason the fact that the other provinces weren't in agreement, and that they thought that an agreement had been entered into and that Quebec should be required to make a lateral tax cut rather than a selective tax cut as they had done. Well, I don't think the minister has always felt it necessary to follow what the provinces have done. If the provinces had chosen to select the across the board tax cut, they should have been prepared to accept that. They'd agreed to it, and I don't see why they should have objected to a selective tax cut. Because one of the values of a selective tax cut was not only that it would reduce the taxes paid by the consumer, but would at the same time stimulate some local industry, certainly in British Columbia. If they'd had the opportunity to cut the taxes on building material so as to stimulate housing, they would have had a double effect. It would have reduced the expenditures of the consumer, and at the same time it would have given quite a fillip to the forest products industry. So that I think that the main objective of that the minister had in mind was how to stimulate the economy. And whether a province wanted to do it by lateral cuts or by a selective cut, it seems to me was totally irrelevant. But I want to remind the minister that this is not the reason he gave to the House when he was debating this matter on second reading, and when we were discussing the changes in the Ways of Means motion. What the minister then said was, of course, that if we allowed any province to have selective cuts, this was equivalent to really putting up tariffs. This was protectionism. Well, of course, that's sheer nonsense. If it would have been protectionism if a province could say, we'll cut the tax for those things produced in our province, but if it comes in from another province, the sales tax will apply. That would have been protectionism. But to remove a portion of the sales tax or all of it from any single commodity was a benefit to whatever province produced that commodity, would have been a benefit to the economy, and would certainly been a benefit to the consumer. I'm not going to labor this any longer, but I just want to say to the minister that the difficulty in which he found himself lies in the lack of long-term planning, that a lot of this could have been eliminated if the government, instead of running on an ad hoc basis of trying something today and something else next week, had sat down last fall and made a concrete proposal. The minister said he made a concrete proposal asking the provinces to, offering to the provinces that he would put up 50% of the cost of a cut in the retail sales tax. Well, I can tell him right now that if I'd been representing the provinces, I would not have accepted a 50% compensation from the federal government. The minister realized that in many of the provinces, the retail sales tax revenue is one of their most important items, and in some of them, the largest item. And to ask them to absorb half the cost of that reduction is asking the provinces to assume a burden that they can't afford. And therefore, he couldn't have expected anything else. And if he was going to make an offer to put up 2/3, then certainly he should have made that offer last October rather than making it a couple of weeks before they announced the budget.